Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Path of Awakening Buddhist course. We're working our way through Shantideva's The Path of the Bodhisattva, and we're on chapter 9. Michael is going to be teaching tonight. Let's bow in. So, Michael, take it away.
Okay, so welcome everyone. If you've had the chance to read through the ninth chapter, you'll understand why it said that it's particularly difficult and challenging to read. There are a lot of reasons for this, actually. John mentioned last week that when Shantideva was presenting this way of the Bodhisattva, it was to a group of monks and scholars who had studied and practiced a great deal. And a lot of what the ninth chapter involves is a real deep delve into particular issues in Buddhist philosophy. And in some ways, I was thinking that it might have worked better almost if it was written as a play, because there are places where he goes back and forth between a particular philosophical view and then the refutation from his point of view. Shantideva himself was a proponent of the Madhyamaka view, which is primarily the view of emptiness that was developed by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. And the ninth chapter is considered a brilliant exposition of the Madhyamaka view, as well as a refutation of all of the views that from the point of view of Madhyamaka, are considered lacking. So last week we heard about shunyata, or emptiness, and I just wanted to read just a brief excerpt from Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, Shunyata chapter, as kind of a refresher, where he says that, so shunyata in this case is the complete absence of concepts or filters of any kind. The absence even of form is empty, and the emptiness is formed conceptualization. It is a question of seeing the world in a direct way without desiring higher consciousness or significance or profundity. It is just directly perceiving things literally as they are in their own right. Ultimately, this is what the Madhyamaka gets to, but it does it by undoing any kind of logic or concept or point of view that we might hold on to that obscures the basic truth of things as they are. It is at times quite challenging. At times, in my own experience, sometimes I've found Madhyamaka arguments really compelling, and other times I've had to really think about, how is this true, or what does this mean? And I think as we go through the chapter tonight, probably, we'll have that same experience again, where some things might really strike us as, oh, that's in terms of their profundity, and other things might just leave us scratching our heads. Frankly, study of all of the Buddhist schools of philosophy, at least in my experience, at times is intriguing and interesting, and other times really frustrating and irritating. And so we might have some of these experiences reading this chapter. In any case, again, the ultimate idea is to recognize shunyata. And as one kind of working definition that we can start with, what the Madhyamaka point of view is trying to get at is the lack of an inherent substance or reality to things. So you might ask ourselves at this point, what does it mean to take something as real? What does it mean to take something as real? And basically in the Pramana tradition, which predates the Madhyamaka, Pramana was a philosophy of being, basically, says that in order to something to be real, it has to meet three criteria. It has to be singular or unitary. In other words, it has to be just one thing, not many things. It has to be permanent, unchanging. Otherwise, it can't be anywhere. If it becomes something else, then it doesn't have any inherent reality. And lastly, it has to be independent. And independent in this case doesn't mean that it's like something that breaks free of something else, like the United States became free of England a couple hundred years ago. What it means is that it exists in its own right without dependence on other conditions. that it doesn't depend on other things for its existence. And Shantideva actually kind of prepared us for this view of emptiness, this view of the lack of inherent substance or reality in things, with some of the verses that we've already read in other chapters. And I actually wanted to begin with one from the previous chapter. So let me put the screen up. Verse 101 here is from the meditation chapter, where he says, "Continua and gatherings, so-called, like garlands and like armies, are unreal. So there is no one to experience pain, for who is there to be its owner?" So I wanted to just say a little bit about what gatherings and continua are, because it'll give a little bit of the flavor of how Madhyamaka philosophy works. So gathering would be something like the example that he gives, a necklace, that we take a collection of things and put them together and call it something like a necklace or a garland, or we put together an assembly of people and call it an army. But it's made up of all these, individual pieces, and it's only when it's put together that we give it a name and then take it to be something real. And there are a lot of examples so that it's not singular, for one thing. It's made up of different things, and it's not independent. It's put together based on causes and conditions. And so for that reason, it lacks its own inherent reality. Sometimes in the Madhyamaka, they'll talk about something existing from its own side. So that what that means is that a garland or a necklace doesn't call itself a garland or a necklace. We put that label on it. An army might call itself an army, but it's still something that's conceptually created or conceptually projected onto something. Continua is a little bit, the idea of a continua is a little bit harder to understand, but I attended a recent teaching with Zigar Kongtrul, where actually he explained it fairly well. So kind of got it for the first time. The example he gave is we could say that we crossed the river, and then a few days later or a week later that we crossed the same river. But in reality, it's not the same river. It's changed just because of the flow of water and the nature of wind and everything else. The river is not exactly the same thing again, and that it's a constantly changing thing. And so on one level, yes, it's the same river that we would have given a name to. On my way to work, I cross over the Farmington River many times, but it's not actually the same river every time. It appears that way. And in a few moments, we'll be talking about relative and absolute truth, which is what this falls under. But it's actually, in reality, not the same river. Trungpa Rinpoche talked about this from a slightly different perspective. In Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, he talks about the continuity of discontinuity. And what that means is it's the very fact that the river is changing that makes it appear continuous. If the river, in fact, were to stop flowing, we wouldn't call it a river anymore, and it wouldn't look like a river. It would be a lake or a pond or a flood, depending on how it actually worked. So it's actually the very continuity, this continuity of continuity, and the projection of sameness onto something that's actually constantly changing that gives it the appearance of being the same. And what's the reason that these kinds of examples and are important in terms of Madhyamaka is it's on the same basis that we impute the idea of a self, that we create the idea of a self, that in fact what we call I or ego or self, first of all, is a collection of a lot of different parts. It's a gathering. And then secondly, the appearance of continuity masks the fact that it's actually always changing and always different, so that it, just as we don't cross in reality, we don't cross the same river, neither are we always the same self. So as I say, and this is why he's saying that there's no one to experience pain, for who is there to be its owner. So I wanted to start with that, just as some examples of the logic that you run into with the Madhyamaka. So with that, I guess we could actually begin looking at verse 1 of chapter 9. And if we have, do we have readers? If people could raise their hand if they're willing to read.
And when we say raise your hand, could you use, what's it called, Michael?
The reactions button on the bottom.
Right.
There.
We can't see everybody all at one time. So if you raise your hand like this, we may not be seeing it. But if you use the reactions button and raise a virtual hand or like a little picture of a hand, then you'll come up to the top of the screen and we can call on you. Michael can.
Okay, so let's see. Philip, could you read verse 1 and don't read the sections in parentheses or in italics? You have to pick and choose a little bit. Or if you have your own text, it might be a little easier even.
All these branches of the doctrine, the enlightened sage expounded for the sake of wisdom. Therefore, they must cultivate this wisdom who wish to have an end of suffering. So
this first verse, like the first verses in all the other chapters, he kind of lays out the basic logic of why what's going to be discussed is important. So in this case, we're talking about the development of wisdom or the development of prajna. And basically the reason that this is important, if we think back to our study before, it said that what obscures reality, what creates suffering, are the two veils. The one veil is the veil of conflicting emotions, the kleshas, and the other is the veil of cognitive obscurations, cognitive confusions. And so the first 5 paramitas really deal largely with clearing away the veil of conflicting emotions. If you think back to the different chapters that they presented, the different chapters that we've read, they presented different remedies for different for different emotional obscurations. For instance, the patience chapter dealt with aggression. The meditation chapter that we read last dealt with attachment, desire. The chapter on exertion or enthusiasm dealt with remedies for laziness. The chapters on carefulness and vigilant introspection altogether dealt with wildness of mind. So these remedies work with the veil of conflicting emotions or the veil of the kleshas. Prajna, or the wisdom chapter, particularly focuses on the veil of the cognitive obstructions, cognitive obscurations, or you could say it deals with ignorance and remedying ignorance. And this is important because it's only through ultimately clearing away the cognitive obscurations that we attain true freedom. It's prajna that sees emptiness. It's prajna that sees shunyata. It's prajna that sees the lack of inherent substance or reality to things. And it's through prajna that the previous paramitas become truly transcendent. So, for example, with the first paramita of generosity, it's through prajna that we develop the threefold purity of seeing no giver, no gift, and no recipient. So the act of giving is in perfect harmony with the situation and without any kind of hangover of expectation or regret or any kind of clinging to any kind of goal or reward. And it's the same way with the paramita of discipline, that if we approach discipline from the point of view of prajna that sees shunyata, then there's no fixed idea of a person to discipline. There's no fixed idea or no rigid concept of the practice itself. And there's no goal so there's no hope or no effort and no fear. And what you end up with is just simply being present, simple knowing, present awareness. And in that sense, the paramita of discipline becomes transcendent. And so it is with the other paramitas as well. So the paramita of prajna is very important. Sometimes there are different analogies for this. Sometimes prajna is seen as like a king and the other 5 paramitas are the army. Sometimes it's said that the other 5 paramitas are like rivers that flow into the ocean of prajna. And it's so that it's through the other paramitas that we're able to develop prajna. because we develop the stability and the freedom from the kleshas that allow us to begin to see clearly. But it's really the vipassana quality of prajna that ultimately frees us, that ultimately frees us from the cognitive obscurations that keep us in the dark, you could say. Could someone read the second verse? Maybe Mark?
Relative and ultimate, these, the two truths, are declared to be. The ultimate is not within the reach of intellect, for intellect is said to be the relative. I go down to ultimate truth, or?
No, they can stop that. No, that's good. That's the main verse. The other things are kind of some definition around that, which you're free to read because I think it will help as well with understanding what we're talking about. So the first verse was actually the easiest to explain, but from now on, we're really stepping in it from ego's point of view. This is what's to be understood, the two truths, absolute and relative, sometimes called relative and ultimate. Sometimes it's referred to as seeming reality and absolute reality. And it's important to understand some things about the relationship between the two truths. It's not a simple true-false dichotomy. In other words, it's not the case that absolute truth negates relative truth. But it does, in some ways, see through relative truth. Relative truth is true within a nexus of causes and conditions. If I were to give you my street address and zip code and you put it in your GPS, you'd arrive at my house. In the nexus of causes and conditions, relative truth is true. But at the same time, there is a difference between relative truth and absolute truth. Generally speaking, relative truth refers to things as they appear or things as they seem to be. And absolute truth is things as they actually are. Each truth is true on its own level. But then it says that absolute truth, the ultimate truth, is not within the reach of intellect, for intellect is said to be the relative. So that's a big row for us, or at least for me, because anything I say about ultimate or absolute truth is by its very nature not it. The words may point to it, but in the end, to really have a grasp to grasp ultimate truth or absolute truth, have to let go of conceptual mind. Any concept is wrong, or at best only partially true. And so you have to get away from the binary intellect, the things either exist or don't exist. And it's also said that the relationship between the two truths is, you can't say that they're not the same, but they're not exactly different either. And there's all kinds of reasonings for why this might be. But basically, it said that if the two truths were different, then realizing absolute truth would mean you'd still have to realize relative truth. And that's not true. On the other hand, if they were the same, then it would be the same as saying that by recognizing relative truth, you'd understand absolute truth. So they're not the same, but they're not different either. And the relationship between the two is one of those things that, just as the verse says, kind of transcends intellect. Could someone read verses 3 through 6? Let's see. How about Judith?
Judith, you're muted.
In light of this, within the world, two kinds of people are observed: those with yogic insight and the common run of people. In this regard, the views of ordinary folk are undermined by yogis who themselves are in the world. Did that come through?
Yep. Keep going.
Keep going.
Yep, through verse 6.
Within whose ranks the lower, in degrees of insight, are confuted by the higher, by means of the examples that the yogis and the worldly both accept. And for the sake of the result, analysis is left aside. When ordinary folk perceive phenomena, they look on them as real and not illusory. This, then, is the subject of debate where ordinary and yogis differ. Forms and so forth, which we all perceive, exist by general acclaim, but not by valid reasoning. They are false, just like, for instance, unclean things, regarded in the common view as pure.
Okay, so to go back to verse 3, because all these verses kind of come together. Verse 3 says that in light of this, within the world, two kinds of people are observed. Ordinary people means people who take things to be just as they appear. That things are real just as they appear, which is, well, speaking for myself, me most of the time. Yogis are those who begin to see things as they actually are, which doesn't mean that they don't understand or see relative truth, but they don't take relative truth to be how things actually are. And those are yogis with yogic insight. In this regard, he says that the view of ordinary folk is undermined by yogis, who themselves are in the world. So what he's saying here is that yogis have a higher view, or a clearer, truer view of what things actually are. When it gets in verse 4, jump ahead. Where he says, within those ranks, the lower in degrees of insight are confuted by the higher. He's talking about beginning, first of all, with ordinary folk, and then all of these schools of Buddhist philosophy, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, each of which have a progressively clearer view of reality. But each have particular obstacles to a clear view as well, which ultimately the Madhyamaka attempts to cut through. So, and by means of examples that the yogis and the worldly both accept, and for the sake of the result, analysis is left aside. The examples that both yogis and the world accept are, for instance, dreams. And the idea is that in a dream, we see things that we take to be real. We are delighted by some things, terrified of other things, because we take the images that we see in a dream to be real. But at the same time, at another point, at least when we wake up, we realize that it wasn't real in the way that we took it to be. But in the dream itself, it appeared real, even though it actually wasn't. And that's the example that's frequently given, particularly by the Chitta Mantra, which we'll talk about in a moment, for how it is that even in daily life, we take things to be real that aren't, just like in a dream that we have in the night. Another example that's frequently given is a mirage, where something appears like water in a desert or water on a road. But when we get closer to it, it disappears, so that it appears to be, that's seeming reality, but in actuality, it doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. Let's see, verse 5. So again, when ordinary folk perceive phenomena, they look at them as real and not illusory. And this is the subject of debate where ordinary and yogis differ. So as I said, there are different philosophical schools with different views of what's absolute and what's relative truth. And as Shantideva says, you could say that one school with a higher view refutes the lower view. So basically, if you were to attend a Tibetan Shedra, you would actually study 4 different schools of philosophy, with the Madhyamaka being seen as the one that's most, I don't know if true is exactly the best word to use, but they all have something to say. And in fact, rather than looking at one as false and other as more real or true, it's possible to look at them as stages of development that we might go through, beginning with the view of ordinary people who see things as they appear and take them to be real just as they are. So the first the first two schools are in the Hinayana. One is the Vaibhashika, and this is one of the two schools that Trungpa Rinpoche talked about in the article we read last week, where he talked about the pluralistic atomists, which he said from the Madhyamaka view was partially true. Basically, what the Vaibhashikas say is that things appear to be what they appear to be, but if they can be broken down in some way, if we could take them apart, either in reality or even just mentally dissect them and pull them apart, then we realize that the reality that we attribute to them is somewhat illusory. So that we could say that a vase, for instance, is a real thing, but if we smash it with a hammer, it ceases to be a vase. So the idea that a vase exists is only temporary or momentary based on its holding together in a certain way. And what they do is they break things down into, as we talked about last week, atoms or partless particles, which they say everything is made up of. And it's said that these partless particles are the absolute reality, that these very much like the theory of atoms and modern science, and that these atoms come together and come apart to make different kinds of substances, which take on a form that appears real, but actually, again, can be broken down so that its appearance as like a vase or a car or a body or whatever it is impermanent and illusory in the sense that it has any real inherent permanent reality to it. They also say that consciousness works the same way, that consciousness is actually made up of units of momentary consciousness, and that what happens is units of momentary consciousness perceive or essentially apprehend is the word that they use, apprehend objects in the world. And that just as something like a vase can be broken down into smaller and smaller parts, so can consciousness be brought down into really existing moments of consciousness. So it's an attempt to deal with and to explain impermanence, particularly subtle impermanence. The idea is that things are from moment to moment constantly arising and subsiding, changing, even though it may be too subtle for us to see. But that's the idea of in the Vaibhashika. And again, from the Madhyamaka point of view, this was partially true. And partially true because, among other things, what they say is that the way things appear is not how they actually are. This is a quick jump into the Madhyamaka. What Madhyamaka does is then say, how can these partless particles, these atoms, truly exist? How can you say they're partless? If there's a particle, if there's something that's real, it has to have a top, a bottom, a side, another side. So it can be broken down further and further and further. And ditto with moments of consciousness, except there it's not broken down into pieces, it's broken down into moments of time. That if you could say there's a truly existing moment, it has to have a beginning and it has to have an ending and there has to be something in between. And you can constantly break that down into smaller and smaller moments until, how can you say that anything really exists? And if you say that they don't really exist in that way, particularly the partless particles, and how do they have any real substance? So that's an example of how Madhyamaka reasoning looks at any kind of assertion about something being real and breaks it down into either contradictions or absurdities to a point where you have you can't hold on to that as a existing solid reality anymore. The other Hinayana school is called the Sautantrika, and I'm mentioning them because they have some interesting ideas about perception. In one way, they're very much like the Vaibhashikas. They also believe in partless particles and moments of, momentary units of consciousness that are truly existing. But they have some different ideas about perception. The one problem they had with perception is how do things which are physical and material become mental? How do they, which is not material, which is not become mind, which is not a material thing. And the way that they explain this is they say that objects in the world cast what they call an aspect or an image on the mind. But what we actually perceive isn't the thing itself, but this aspect or image that's cast by the object itself. So whatever you're looking at, the computer right now, what you're seeing from a Sautantrika point of view is just an image of the real thing. That's an aspect that's cast upon the mind. And by aspect, they mean such things in some ways in a very down-to-earth way that you could see the front of your computer, but you can't see the back. And yet that's also part of the same thing. And it's an interesting point of view because it actually kind of accords with a lot of modern theories of perception. They also have, related to this idea of perception, they talk about two modes of perceiving or two modes of experience that we have with objects, which are given kind of awkward name of specifically characterized phenomena and generally characterized phenomena. So the idea of a specifically characterized phenomena is it's a discrete, immediate moment of perception without any kind of mental labeling or conceptualization. So that, for instance, with something that we see, it's literally just perceiving color and form. Or if it's a sound, it's literally just hearing the sound before any meaning is given to the sound. And that's a specifically characterized phenomena. So it's a very immediate moment of perception. Generally characterized phenomena are what develops out of the concepts that we develop based on experiences with SCPs or specifically characterized phenomena, so that we have an idea of table as, something with like four legs and a flat top. And we begin to see all tables in terms of that concept. It's the kind of thing that we get into where, what's that saying? If you've seen one tree, you've seen them all. From the point of view of a generally characterized phenomena where we actually are seeing the concept and not the thing itself, you could say that's true. From the point of view of seeing things on the level of specifically characterized phenomena, each tree is unique and distinct. And this is purely on the perceptual level, but you can begin to see how there's somewhat different ideas in there about absolute and relative truth, how things appear and what they are. And that from a Sautantrika point of view, the more we get caught up in generally characterized phenomena, in other words, seeing the world through our concepts, the more we end up seeing things as they appear, but not as they actually are, because we're actually creating the appearance through our concepts. This idea gets elaborated a great deal in the next school, the Chittamatra or mind-only school, because in that it's kind of an extension, you could say, of some of the ideas of perception in the Sautantrika. In the mind-only school, what they say is that there's no real existing outer objects, that whatever we experience, this world around us, the computer you're looking at right now, whatever you might be feeling, whatever you might be hearing, is all a projection or a creation of mind. That depending on the school of Chittamatra, either that they would actually say that there's no truly existing outer objects, or they would at least say that the only way we can know outer objects is through the mind. And the mind itself is taken to be real, even though all the experiences, all these projections and perceptions of mind are not real. Trungpa Rinpoche talks about this school a little bit in the chapter that we read last week, and says that, among other things, it's the first one that really begins to transcend subject and object, because the idea is in everything is mind. The problem with the Chittamatra school from a Madhyamaka point of view is they take the mind itself to be real. And there are different objections to this, or as Shantideva says, each school confutes the lower one. The idea there is that if the only way we know mind is by what it's aware of, and if we're saying all the things that are out that we believe are out there, even though that's again a projection of mind, and if all of those things don't truly exist, then how can you say the mind itself exists? So it's a kind of the Chittamatra view of mind only is kind of a subtle kind of eternalism, you could say. It's not, as solid as a belief in, but that's essentially how the Madhyamikas refute it. From the Madhyamika point of view, relative truth is just whatever beings say that it is, and this is in verse 6. Forms and so forth, which we all perceive, exist by general acclaim, but not by valid reasoning. So from a Madhyamika point of view, relative truth, seeming reality is whatever beings say that it is. You could say it's as if there was like a vote or a poll, and people decided, well, this is what this is called, and this is, what this is, and that's what that is. But, really, Madhyamika doesn't have a lot to say about relative truth. The Yogacara has much more to say about the nature of relative truth than the Madhyamika. What Madhyamika does is to use all these different reasonings to undermine this view that things exist as they appear. And all the subtler and subtler versions of apparent absolute reality in the starting with the partless particles and some of the ideas about perception, and then the idea that mind itself truly exists even if other things don't exist, and cuts through all of those views so that we're just left with immediate experience and a direct experience of reality when we're able to see things through that way. So verse 7, but that he might instruct the worldly, our protector, the Buddha, spoke of things, but these in truth lack even momentariness. Now, if you say that it's wrong to claim them, let me stop there for a moment. So when he says the protector, he's talking about the Buddha. And what he's talking about is all of the teachings of the Buddha where he talked about things. And by things, primarily is talking about such things as the five skandhas, form, feeling, perception, the ayatanas and dhatus, the eye and form, sound and ear, and sound ear, and sound consciousness. All of those things, talked about those as provisional teachings that are presented because that's what people are able to understand. If the Buddha had tried to teach emptiness in the beginning, it would have been just incomprehensible to people. We struggle with it now, and we've studied this stuff for a while. So you can imagine his first teachings were the Four Noble Truths. But so he instructed the worldly, people who took reality to be things just as they appear, by talking about things. But in truth, these lack even momentariness. Now, if you say it's wrong, but now he's beginning to get into a whole section of the chapter 9 where he talks about different views of the Hinayana and the Chittamatra, and all of their objections to the idea of emptiness or shunyata. And it begins by talking about these in truth lack even momentariness. What he's talking about here is the view of momentariness that is a Sautantrika and Vaibhashika view, that things exist in reality even for a moment, even if they're constantly changing, and says that even this is relative. But it's not how most people perceive things. From the point of view of ordinary beings, things just are what they are. We get caught up in, as I was saying before, gatherings where we put together objects and give it a label and believe that it exists. We get caught up in continua, the fact that the reality that things are changing, but we see them as always the same. And that is, again, not the ultimate view, but it is something different than how ordinary beings see this. So this, I realize I'm kind of getting a little wordy here, which is one of the things I worried about. But this is why he goes through all of these different schools, because all of them have some truth to them, but also in some ways they're misleading. They're partially true, as Trungpa Rinpoche said. And ultimately, we have to see through these to shunyata. And so if you say it's wrong to claim the momentary is relative, there's no fault. For momentariness is relative for yogis, but for worldly beings, it's ultimate. From a point of view of a worldly being who thinks things just exist just as they are and have some kind of permanent, singular, and independent existence, then beginning to even see momentariness is a step away from the relative point of view. All right, so the rest of a number of these verses afterward deal with different points of view that are, or objections to the doctrine of shunyata, or the idea of shunyata. So for instance, if the Buddha doesn't exist, it's just an illusion, how do we have merit? And the answer is, well, if you believe in an illusory Buddha and do things that create illusory merit, then it exists on a relative level. And there's a lot of different refutations that would take a long time to work our way through. So we're going to jump to verse 30. But all the verses that we're skimming by are all the different arguments that are presented by the practitioners of the Hinayana, the Shravakas, as well as the Chittamatrans, which is a Mahayana school, and are how the Madhyamaka would respond to those. So starting with verse 30, could someone read verse 30? Let me see. Dan, could you read verse 30?
Even if we know that all is like illusion, how, you ask, will this dispel afflictive passion? Magicians may indeed themselves desire the mirage women they themselves create.
Okay, so what Shantideva is talking about here is he's working with the people who might object to the idea that meditation, the contemplation of emptiness actually will bring some kind of liberation. So what we're saying here is, even if we know that something illusory, we could still be attracted to it. Even if we know that, of course, and this was, again, 600-700 AD. Nowadays we have images in the computer and movie screen and everything else, and we do react to them as if they were real. So this is the question that he's asking. This is the question that Shantideva is posing. Again, I think if this were written as a play and you had Shantideva as the answerer and then you had a clearly defined role of someone else presenting an objection or a question or, a concern of some kind, it would maybe be a little clearer, some of the back and forth. So this is being presented as an objection. What do you mean that understanding emptiness will bring some kind of liberation? And he begins to answer with verse 31. So if, Philip, could you read verse 31?
The reason is they have not rid themselves of habits of desiring objects of perception, and when they gaze upon such things, their aptitude for emptiness is weak indeed.
So again, this kind of goes back to some of the remedies that we talked about in other weeks and in other chapters, that because the person is still attached to objects of perception, which if you remember was a lot of what the chapter of meditation involved working through, really seeing through desire, seeing through attachment, realizing the illusory nature of, and the problematic nature of becoming attached to objects of perception. Because that hasn't been worked through, the aptitude for emptiness is weak indeed. Verses 32 and 33 kind of explain the path quality of what we're working with here. So let's see. Steve, could you read verses 32 and 33?
By training in this aptitude for emptiness, the habit to perceive real things will be relinquished. By training in the thought there isn't anything, this view itself will be also abandoned. There is nothing. When this is asserted, no thing is there to be examined. How can a nothing, wholly unsupported, rest before the mind as something present?
Okay, so what he's talking about here again is the path, or you could say the practice of Madhyamaka reasoning, Madhyamaka contemplation, which begins with the first line there, by training in this aptitude for emptiness. So basically, if we understand emptiness, then this counteracts our fixation on real existence. The example given in the commentary is if a person actually realized that this image wasn't real but illusory, they wouldn't feel as the interest that they do in the illusory thing that they perceive. And that the root of craving or desire is born from conceptual elaboration. First, we take something to be real in a certain way, or we have a perception and then begin attaching concepts to it. And so the idea here is that by repeated training in seeing through the illusory nature of things, and repeated training in seeing that although things appear in a certain way, that's not how they actually are. We cultivate the habit of considering phenomena as empty of any kind of real or inherent existence. So this involves contemplation of dependent origination, contemplation of impermanence, all of those reasonings of all the philosophical schools that we talked about just a moment ago. But even Madhyamaka really works with breaking things, among other things, by breaking things down into parts. It's literally called the reasoning of the one and the many. And the idea is that, again, you take something that you take to be as singular or unitary, independent and permanent, and really look at it and realize that you can all break it down into smaller and smaller parts. And then eventually the parts themselves lack any kind of reality. And that this kind of cuts through eternalism. The point is, and all of the different Madhyamaka reasonings work this way, that they work by asking us to really look at what's the reality of what we believe, and does it really make sense when we take it to its logical conclusion. So we do this by repeated training and begin to see through. The idea is that we have the habit of taking things real. The idea is that we've had a lifetime of doing this, taking ourselves to be real as, real ego, real, permanent, independent, singular thing. And we take objects to be real, things to be real, the world around us to be real in a way that it isn't. So we first have to accustom ourselves to non-existence. But then you ask, how is non-existence refuted? And this is where you have an interesting Madhyamaka twist of logic that you might have to think about for a moment. But the basic idea is that for us to say that something doesn't exist, in other words, no eye, no ear, no tongue, no form, form is emptiness, all of those things, when we begin to contemplate what it means to say those things, what the meaning is of those teachings, we're breaking down the idea of existence. When we come up with an idea of non-existence, in order to have an idea of non-existence, we have to have the idea that something existed to begin with. So therefore, the idea of non-existence is dependent on the idea of existence. And because when existence isn't real, then non-existence has to not be real as well. That's, I hope I made that clear enough. It's a real twist of Madhyamaka logic. But the idea is that the concept of non-existence is dependent on the idea of existence. And since it doesn't have a reality of its own, but it's dependent on something else, then it doesn't have any existence either. And this is what brings us to verse 34. Let's see, Ed, could you read verse 34?
When something and its non-existence both are absent from before the mind, no other option does the latter have. It comes to perfect rest, from concepts free.
Okay, I'm going to give a couple of different interpretations of verse 34 from both Kunzig Palden and also from the Kataka Jewel. They're essentially saying the same thing, but in somewhat different words. So when neither the thing to be negated, whatever it is that we're taking to be real, the self, ego, other, another person, whatever it might be, the existence of an automobile, the existence of a river, any of those things, when neither the thing to be negated nor the non-existence of the thing, the negation itself, are present to the mind, no alternatives to true existence remains. The mind has no object to fix on, no ideas like it's empty or it's not empty, and all conceptual activity is brought to complete stillness. This is a state of equality which is like the abyss of space. There is no name for it is beyond thought and explanation, perfectly revealed by self-cognizing awareness wisdom. So that's how Kunzig Palden explains this verse. In the Kataka Jewel, it said, if you teach people that dharmata is non-substantiality, they will cling to nihilistic emptiness. So this is very similar to what we read about last week when Trungpa Rinpoche wrote about form is emptiness, but emptiness is also form. If you teach people that dharmata, which things as they are, is non-substantiality, they will cling to nihilistic emptiness. If you teach them that our appearance is manifest within it, they'll cling to true existence. If you talk about dharmata as an entity, as a unity, in other words, both real and unreal, they'll cling to an understanding that is like black and white coiled together in a rope. If you talk about the inconceivability of dharmata, they will only think that it is like a view of nothing whatsoever. It goes on to say, if everyone easily understood the dharmata of ultimate profundity, then there would be no need to say that dharmata transcends all of samsara, transcends all concepts, transcends all words. That it's difficult to see. Therefore, refuting one does not establish the other. Having refuted all extreme views, one enters into the suchness of dharmata that is finally free of negation and establishment. One accumulates merit until one finds the depth of certainty in dharmata that is the great equality, free from meeting and parting, and that from the very beginning is the emptiness of unborn appearance and dependent arising. So this verse is a really important verse because it's really talking about what can happen through the study, through the meditation, and through the contemplation of Madhyamaka reasoning. That when we get to the point where we can see that things don't exist in the way that we think that they do, and we can see that their non-existence is also doesn't exist, then the mind lets go. The mind relaxes. The mind enters into, as Trungpa Rinpoche said, just seeing things as they are without any concept at all. So it's really talking about a complete letting go. So if you remember in the story of Shantideva, when he presented this ninth chapter, that it said that he began to rise up in the air and eventually disappeared and only his voice was heard. It's with this verse 34, that he began to rise in the air. So it really, in terms of explaining the path and the importance of working with Madhyamaka reasoning in such a way, I think it really highlights the importance of it. So with that, we're going to go to verses 57 through 59. There's a lot of pieces in between where Shantideva refutes objections in regard to the benefits of this practice and objections that the Mahayana isn't the Buddhist teachings, but we're not going to talk about that. Actually, we could go back one verse to verse 56. Which is not a verse that we put out, but it goes into why it's important to begin thinking about these things. So let's see. Judith, could you read verse 56?
Sure. If such a thing as I exists indeed, then terrors granted will torment it. But since no self or I exists at all, what is there left for fears to terrify?
So again, here he's talking about the benefit of coming to understand shunyata, particularly in regard to holding on to the idea of an ego of self or a sense of I about oneself. And starting with verse 57 through 59, he really invites us to really contemplate what the self is, or what it is that we, how it is that we attribute a self to form in particular. So I think we should actually do this as a contemplation, just as he says. And so in a lot of ways, Madhyamaka contemplation is very similar to the contemplation that, if you were with us when we read Tralag Rinpoche's text on Mahamudra, it's very similar. We begin by allowing the mind to settle. So if everyone could take a good posture and a good seat, straight back, upright, but at the same time relaxed, and just take a moment just to settle into posture first. Feel how you're feeling, and whatever confusion or clarity I may have generated through what I've said so far, let go of all of that, and let go of any other thoughts, and just work with the breath. And again, no particular special breath, just the breath, whatever it is, however it might be. Just feel the breath. Work with in and out breath if you want. Just feel the breath, breathing in, breathing out, slowing down. We could work with just the out breath the way that we usually do. Feel the breath. As you breathe out, identify with the breath, become one with the breath, dissolve with the breath into space, just expanding and opening. And just settle. Just bring yourself fully present here and now. You become distracted. Just see that. The main point being to rest in awareness, to stay in awareness. Thoughts may come and go, but we can just rest in awareness. Become distracted, just begin again, feeling the breath, working with the breath. Just come back again and again. So this is the first step with any kind of contemplative practice, that to settle the mind, because so long as we're distracted, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to actually look at our experience, which is the second thing. We actually want to look at our immediate experience of where we feel the I or the self is. Where is the I? Where is the self? Well, there's some suggestions in the Shantideva text, but in my reading, it's suggested that, in fact, the best way to begin with this is to look at whatever part of the body we're most attached to, whatever it is that we most identify with, whatever this might be. Head, face, eyes, muscles, genitals, whatever it might be. Just to look at that and ask, where is the self in this part of the body? Where is the I? How is it that we identify with this? How is it that we're attached to this? It could also be some part of the body that we have a negative feeling about, self that we might self-deprecate or not like about ourselves. But even with that, we realize there's a great deal of a projection of a sense of self. But the idea is, again, to just look and see, where does the sense of I, the sense of self, where does it arise? Where does it abide? What is its nature? What is this self that we project onto the body, onto the inner organs, into the things that come from the body? Could look at other parts of the body that maybe we're not so attached or identify with, and look at that. How is it that some parts we feel are more I or self, and other parts not so much? And again, the idea is to look at present experience. If we end up thinking too much about a case history or why things got to be that way, either come back to present experience or even come back to the breath for a moment as a reference point, and then look again. Where is the self? What is the nature of this self? And then finally, let go altogether of any effort, any looking, and just rest in finding, not finding, whatever it might be. So, Shantideva's text, let's see, maybe Philip, could you read verses 57 through 59?
The teeth, the hair, the nails are not the eye, and eye is not the bones or blood. The mucus from the nose and phlegm are not the eye, and neither is it made of lymph or pus. The eye is not the body's grease or sweat. The lungs and liver likewise do not constitute it. Neither are the inner organs eye, nor yet the body's excrement and waste period. The flesh and skin are not the eye, and neither are the body's warmth and breath. The cavities within the frame are not the eye, and eye is not accounted for in sixfold consciousness.
So basically, what is traditionally said is we construct a sense of I on the basis of the five skandhas, beginning with form, which includes, among other things, the body. And that it's through, it's a type of gathering, as we talked about in the very beginning, that we take all these disparate parts and put it together into some sense of self, some sense of I. The things that Shantideva picks here, beginning with the teeth, the hair, the nails are not I, and so on and so forth, actually correspond to descriptions of the five elements. So teeth, hair, nails are solid things, mucus and so on are liquid, or water, liquid things. Lungs and liver correspond to again to the internal organs. Warmth and breath correspond to fire and air, and the cavities in the body correspond to space. So the idea is that the body, and what we attribute a sense of self to, is a gathering of the five elements: earth, air, fire, water, and space. I don't know if there's particularly cultural or historical reasons why these are the particular things that he picked, but again, when I had this kind of contemplation presented to me, I think it was a good suggestion to begin with, by looking at the things that we do identify with, and then look at the fact that there are many parts, and that it's basically this sense of self is a construction or a creation of mind, and doesn't have its own inherent reality. That it's put together out of causes and conditions. Starting in verse 60, if we could just jump ahead one, I'll just read it myself. He begins talking about consciousness, and the point of view of whether consciousness is there all the time or not. If hearing consciousness is permanent, it means we'd be hearing a sound all the time. But if there's no object, in other words, if there's no sound, how does it cognize? How could you call it a consciousness if it's not present? In other words, that consciousness doesn't exist unless it has an object. Hearing consciousness doesn't exist without sound. Sight consciousness doesn't exist without a color or form. And if you say that it's exists separate from the object, then you have the problem of saying, well, then it's unconscious. Then you could say a tree can hear or a stick can hear. So it begins to really get into, and all the verses that follow, really looking at what reality we attach to consciousness, and really begins to question, because consciousness is a changing thing, how can we say it's permanent? How can we say it's independent when it's dependent on having an object? So again, all the different things that we attach a reality to begin to, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, become more slippery. I'm going to jump ahead to verse 77. 78. 77 we'll start with. Here again, this is a meditation on what we call body, which is sort of similar to what we just did, but a little different. Let's see, Dan, could you read verse 77?
The source of sorrow is the pride of saying I. It's fostered and increased by false belief in self. To this you may believe that there is no redress, but meditation on no self will be the supreme way.
Okay, and here again, he begins by looking at what it is that we call a body and how it's made up of parts. So let's see, Judith, could you read verses 78 through 82?
Uh, 78.
78 to 82, yeah.
What we call the body is not feet or shins. The body likewise is not thighs or loins. It's not the belly, nor indeed the back. And from the chest and arms, the body is not formed. The body is not ribs or hands, armpits, shoulders, bowels, or entrails. It is not the head, and it is not the throat. What is the body, then, in all of this? If the body spreads itself, and with the members coincides, its parts indeed are present in those parts. But where does body in itself abide? But if the body, single and entire, is present in the hands and other members, however many parts there are, the hands, and all the rest, you'll find an equal quantity of bodies. If body is not outside or within its parts, how is it then residing in its members? And since it is not other than its parts, how can you say that it exists at all?
Okay, so this section is called close mindfulness of body. And in some ways, it's similar to the meditation that we just did, only in this case, rather than looking for a self, we're looking at the term body, which is something that we all think we have, and we certainly do on the level of relative truth. Again, seeming appearance. And again, relative truth doesn't mean exactly unreal, although in some cases it might. But when we begin to break the body down into parts, we realize that we can't say the body exists in the hand. The hand isn't the body, yet the hand is part of the body. Ditto with the feet, the legs, and so on. So it can all be broken down to these parts. But if we see it as but if we then say, well, it's a partless whole, then we have to decide whether there's a body in each part, or are there multiple bodies, or is each part the body? But where exactly is the body as a whole and entirely relative to all its parts? So again, this is an example of Madhyamaka reasoning in terms of the one and many that we talked about, where something can be broken down into parts, and then you look at the term or the concept body, and realize that it's imputed onto these things, it's projected onto all of these different parts, but that there's no truly existing body that can be seen separate from the parts, so that it's a collection of parts to which we attribute a label. And the idea is that we do this with just about everything that we encounter conceptually. Again, it kind of goes back to the idea of the Sautantrika idea of generally characterized phenomena, where we see the concept and not the actual thing. I think it's interesting that he uses close mindfulness of body and feelings and mind. We'll leave out the part about phenomena. That's also there. But these are the four foundations of mindfulness, which is a Hinayana teaching. But it's taken in a Madhyamaka way to really look at the absence of a true inherent reality in the things themselves, that the reality is projected onto things by the mind, the label is projected onto things by the mind. But when we actually look at the parts, or see that it can be broken down in parts, and that the parts are the body but not the whole body, so you end up like really realizing that there's no inherent reality to the notion of body itself. And this is why in verse 83, thus there is no body, it's through illusion. And by putting these things together, the body as notion is covered. And he says it's just because like a specific shape, you could see a pile of stones taken for a man. Or if you've ever had the momentary thing, like there's a shirt hanging on a chair, or there's a coat rack in the room, and you enter very quickly, you see it out of the corner of your eye, and for a minute you think there's a person there. It's illusory in that way, and that's what he means by again, this kind of projection of this label. And I think it is kind of similar to when Trungpa Rinpoche presents the mindfulness of body. He talks about the difference between somatic body or mind body versus body body. And I think when we see through the concept, when we see through, then we actually have some experience of body body, just the body as it is, without looking at all the labels and then all the projections and ideas of good or bad, better or worse that we put on the body. Could jump to verses 88 through 91. And let's see, Steve, could you read verse 88?
If suffering itself is truly real, why is joy not altogether quenched thereby? If pleasure is real, then why will pleasant tastes not comfort and amuse a man in agony?
So here is looking at, this is close mindfulness of feelings. And I think the word close is interesting because I think by close, I think what it means is talking about looking at our actual experience, because most of the time, conceptually, we skate on the surface of things, but he's asking us to really look at the experience. So he's saying if suffering itself had its own inherent reality, if it was really, again, permanent, independent, and just one simple thing, how would we ever experience joy? Because suffering would never go away. We would always just feel that way. It would totally destroy joy. And you could say, the other it's true the other way. So if suffering is ultimately real, why doesn't it prevent the arising of happiness forever? But the reality is that it doesn't, and vice versa. If we have happiness, why doesn't it utterly destroy suffering? And the reason is because it's dependent on causes and conditions. That it appears, and it has a certain reality. It has a certain relative reality, but it's said to be like a rainbow, or a rainbow depends on causes and conditions. It depends on sunlight. It depends on moisture in the air. It depends on the sky having at least some clarity for the sunlight to come through. It depends on the angle of light relative to the water. And if all these conditions come together, a rainbow appears. But the rainbow doesn't appear out of its own substance. It appears because of the coming together of causes and conditions. And it will last as long as the causes and conditions last. But once the conditions change, the rainbow disappears. In the same way, feelings aren't real. They appear due to causes and conditions, but have no reality of their own outside of those causes and conditions. Then he begins to, so this is looking at internal experience of feeling. The second two lines, if pleasure is real, then why will pleasant taste not comfort and amuse a man in agony? What he's looking at here are that feeling isn't in objects. If feeling was in the objects, then even if somebody was in great pain, but they tasted something that was utterly delightful, then the agony would go away. But that's not what happens. The feeling isn't in the object either. It's projected onto the object. So then someone might object, well, the reason that you don't, why someone in agony, somebody who's experienced some kind of terrible loss, wouldn't enjoy something that tastes delicious because of the agony. They'd say, well, that objection's presented in the next verse. So, Steve, could you read verse 89?
If the feeling fails to be experienced through being overwhelmed by something stronger, how can feeling rightly be ascribed to that which lacks the character of being felt?
So here he's saying, this is again relating back to the person in agony who doesn't experience a pleasant taste, doesn't feel joy because, so then if you say, well, it's because the one feeling is stronger, then how could you just say that there's any feeling at all to the other thing if it's never felt? And then verse, 90 and 91. Ed, could you read those?
Perhaps you say that only subtle pain remains. Its grosser form has now been overmastered. Or rather, it is felt as mere pleasure. But what is subtle still remains itself. If, because its opposite is present, discomfort fails to manifest, is not proclaim that it's a feeling, is not proclaiming that it's a feeling no more than a mental imputation?
So basically, we're talking about here is the fact, the emptiness of that comes out of defining things in terms of their opposites. That pain and pleasure or dark or light are somewhat defined by their opposites. So again, one is dependent on the other. And again, it's only through causes and conditions and through mental imputations that we experience these feelings. We could jump to verses 102. Here he's talking about mind and looking for where does mind itself or the mental consciousness exist. So let's see. Philip, could you read verses 102 through 105?
The mind within the senses does not dwell. It has no place in outer things like form, and in between the mind does not abide. Not out, not in, not elsewhere can the mind be found. It is not in the body, yet it is nowhere else. It does not merge with it, nor stand apart. Something such as this does not exist, not even slightly. Beings by their nature are beyond the reach of suffering. If consciousness perceives the cognized object, with regard to what does it arise?
Mhm.
If consciousness arises at the same time as its object, again, regarding what does it arise? If consciousness comes later than its object, once again, from what does it arise? Thus, the origin of all phenomena exceeds the reach of understanding.
So here again, we have a Madhyamaka contemplation looking at the mind itself. And the first two verses really look at where is the mind? Is it in the sense organs? Is it in sense perceptions? Is it outside in the forms and sounds and so on that we hear? Is it in between? And basic idea is not in, not out, nowhere else can the mind be found. If we really look at our in the moment experience, if we don't get too caught up in a subject-object dichotomy, which is, from a point of view of even Chitta Matra, illusory. If we actually look at experience, where is the mind? It's not in the body, yet nowhere else. It doesn't merge with things, it doesn't stand apart. And then in looking at consciousness itself, and this is the whole idea of here is consciousness precedes the object with regard to what does it arise. This is an example of a classical Madhyamaka reasoning about cause and effect. That if does the cause come before the effect? Is it simultaneous with the effect, or is it after the effect? And the point is, if consciousness precedes the cognized object, in which the conscious is there first, how can you say it's already there? How can you say it arose? In regard to what did it arise? If you say that they're at the same time, in other words, if cause and effect are happening at the same time, how can you separate them? How can you differentiate them? And if you say the effect arises, the cause comes after the effect, how can that be? How can there be any connection between them at all? This is a standard Madhyamaka reasoning about the emptiness of cause and effect. The cause has to be, again, before, during, simultaneous with, or after. But how can that be? If the cause comes before the effect, how can there be a connection? If the cause comes at the same time as the effect, how can you separate them? How can you say one causes the other if they're simultaneous? And if the cause comes after the effect, how can that be? How did it arise to begin with? In a similar kind of way, there's also a similar cause and effect reasoning about whether the cause and effect are the same or different. If the idea is if the cause and effect are the same, then why do you need to talk about one or the other? It would just always be there, because there wouldn't be a need for an effect that comes after. And if they're different, then the absurdity of that is that anything could cause anything if they're not the same. And yet that's clearly not true. So there are a lot of Madhyamaka reasonings that really look at things in this way and gets to let go of concepts and ideas. I want to jump to, I'm going to skip a couple of verses here. Jump to verse 140. Yes, we're almost out of time. That's why we're jumping ahead and skipping a bunch of verses that I asked people to read. So verses 140, well, actually 141, 142 really look at correct view. But I'm going to begin with 140. Steve, could you read verse 140?
When therefore in one's dream a child has died, the state of mind that thinks it is no more supplants the thought that it is living still, and yet both thoughts are equally deceptive.
So the idea is that somebody has a dream that they have a child that they don't have, and then in the dreams that the child dies. But both the existence and the non-existence of that child are equally deceptive. In a way, it's similar to what we talked about in verse 134, where both the thing itself and the negation of the thing are both seen to be non-existent. And with that, verses 141 and 142 kind of are a statement of correct view. So Judith, could you read 141 and 142?
Sure. Therefore, as we see through such investigation, nothing is that does not have a cause, and nothing is existent in its causes, taken one by one or in the aggregate. It does not come from somewhere else, neither does it stay nor yet depart. How will what confusion takes for truth in any sense be different from a mirage?
So what's being said here is that things arise, things don't arise uncaused, but they don't proceed from any one cause. And if they don't proceed from any one cause, we can't say they actually abide in any collection of causes as well. In other words, things appear, but they don't abide in the cause. The rainbow is different from the causes, yet it isn't caused by any one thing. Or another way to put it is the effect doesn't arise from itself. It doesn't arise from something different. If it can't arise from either itself or something different, it can't be both. And it doesn't arise, with no cause at all. So the result doesn't abide in the causes, meaning that, and when it talks about not going anywhere or staying, it's if it doesn't exist to begin with. If we were to say it did exist, it would have to come from somewhere. And if it did exist when it left, we'd have to say it goes somewhere. But it doesn't. So that's why it talks about it doesn't stay, nor does it depart, because it didn't exist to begin with. So, and then you end with how will what confusion takes for truth in any sense be different from a mirage? If we go to verse 151, we're a little over time, sorry, but I want to wrap this up. Time is illusory too. Don't forget about that. Let's see. Dan, could you read verses 151 through 154?
Yep. With things that in this way are empty, what is there to gain and what to lose? Who is there to pay me court and honors, and who is there to scorn and to revile me? Pleasure, sorrow, whence do these arise? What is there to give me joy and pain? If I search their very suchness, who is craving? What is craved? More? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, to 154.
Okay. Examine now this world of living beings. Who is there therein to pass away? What is there to come and what has been, and who indeed are relatives and friends? May beings like myself discern and grasp that all things have the character of space, but those who seek their happiness and ease through disputes.
We can stop there, I guess. So basically what he's talking about in these verses are the result of actually realizing emptiness, that it's freedom from worldly concerns, it's freedom from worldly preoccupations, it's freedom from suffering and struggle, freedom from ego-driven goals. And with that, there's tremendous space, a tremendous sense of peace, a tremendous appreciation of things, everything we read about last week in the Shunyata chapter. The next part, which is, I guess, what this is the compassion that results as a result of this experience, beginning with verse 154 through 160, begins talking about what it's like for beings who don't realize shunyata, who don't realize the emptiness of things, who are caught up in constant struggle and suffering and pain as a result of taking things to be real in a way that they're not. Maybe I'll read it. May beings like myself discern and grasp that all things have the character of space, but those who seek their happiness and ease through disputes or enjoyments, all are deeply troubled, or else thrilled with joy. They suffer, strive, contend among themselves, slashing, stabbing, injuring each other. They live their lives engulfed in evil and travail. From time to time, they surface in states of bliss, but then abandoning themselves to many pleasures, but dying, down they fall to suffer torment, long unbearable in realms of sorrow. Many are the charms and abysses of existence where the truth of suchness is not found. All is contradiction, all denial. Suchness in this world is not like this. Here, exceeding all description, is the shoreless scene of pain unbearable. Here it is that strength is low and lives are flickering and brief. All activities for the sake of life and health, relief of hunger and of weariness, time consumed in sleep, all accident and injury, and sterile friendships with the childless. Thus life passes quickly, meaningless. True discernment hard it is to have. How therefore shall we ever find the means to curb the futile wanderings of the mind? So all of this suffering results because beings don't recognize, don't realize shunyata, because beings cling to an ego. And as we come to realize that this suffering is both tremendous and needless, that it's all based on an illusion, it's based on a false belief, there's a development of tremendous compassion. And with this, he ends, he continues with this, but the last two verses, 166 and 167, with an aspiration and dedication. Let's see. Judith, could you read 160, or no, actually, Steve, could you read 166 and 167?
When shall I be able to allay and quench the dreadful heat of suffering's blazing fires with plenteous rains of my own bliss that pour torrential from my clouds of merit? My wealth of merit gathered in with reverence, but without conceptual target. When shall I reveal this truth of emptiness to those who go to ruin through belief, and real existence?
So this is, again, his aspiration and dedication at the end of this chapter. And I could say this for myself as well. When will I have the direct experience of suchness, the union of appearance and emptiness? When would I be able to show and teach beings these great truths that bring utter liberation? And with that, we should truly come to an end. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you.
So I guess we should do the closing chants. I'm sorry for going over by quite a bit.
Thanks,
But then again, time is an illusion.
Mike.
Based on conceptual
It
reference.
was worth it.
That's good.
So, John, who put up the closing chants? And I don't know, Trip, were you doing the chants?
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes. Yep. You can just put them up.
Okay. See if I can do it.
Thank you.
Can you see these closing chants?
Not yet.
Nope.
Let's see if I can do it. Oh, there we go. That's good because my computer was struggling.
Okay. We will close by saying a prayer for peace and dedicating the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones,
Blessings of enlightened and compassionate
by
ones.
the power of my positive actions of 3 times, and my
Positive
prayers
actions
of
of
pure
3 times.
aspiration,
Prayers of pure
may
aspiration.
wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, Michael.
Michael, that was terrific. Thank you.
That
was incredible, Michael. Thank you.
Yes,
Excellent.
it was outstanding, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Trip.
That
Thank
was
you.
just great.
Add one study verse, chapter 9, it really, as one article that I read said, you really should read it with a commentary. Vincent Paulden's helps, but on its own, it's incomprehensible. Not all of it, but parts of it are really hard to follow. But thank you, everyone, for bearing with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
No, thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Hi, everyone.
Sleep
Night.
well.
Good night.